The static zone was no ordinary space in the universe. It wasn't just dark, it was absent, a flaw in a cosmos that was supposed to be infinite. To the navigators aboard the Odysseus, the phenomenon was a wound in the fabric of space-time, a place where signals disappeared and entire ships dissolved as if they had never existed. But there was something even stranger. As they approached, the nearby stars seemed to warp, as if being drawn into an invisible vacuum. "This isn't a black hole," Aaliyah then said, adjusting the ship sensors. "It's something else. Something that shouldn't be here." The Odysseus was more than a ship, it was a team, an extension of its crew. Led by the seasoned Cale Ariston, the crew faced the unknown with caution. Cale was a pragmatic captain, someone who believed in action more than theories. Aaliyah, a brilliant theoretical physicist, saw the static zone as an opportunity to solve the universe's greatest mystery, even if it pushed her to an emotional breaking point. Ivar Droz, the pilot, was the skeptic, his dark past making him resistant to risk. And then there was Raina Sol, a linguist and cryptographer whose presence on the mission was an enigma to everyone, except herself. When the Odysseus crossed the threshold of the static zone, the universe around them changed instantly. The silence became absolute, as if even sound had been consumed by the void. The ship's lights flickered erratically, and the sensors displayed readings that made no sense. "We're outside any known parameters," Aaliyah said, her voice tense. On the main screen, a series of luminous flashes appeared like distant echoes. But there was something else, a presence invisible but palpable. "Do you feel that?" Ivar asked. Everyone felt it, but no one could explain it. That's when the signal began. A rhythmic sequence of low, steady beats, like a mechanical heartbeat, invaded the ship's systems. "This isn't natural," Raina said, leaning over the controls. "It feels like a pattern, but I can't decipher it." As she analyzed the data, Cale stared at the screen with narrowed eyes. "This isn't just a sound. It's a call." The idea that someone or something could be on the other side was both fascinating and terrifying. As they moved closer to the signal's epicenter, the static zone revealed its most disturbing face. Fragments of matter floated in the void, like pieces of something that had been destroyed or never completed. At the center emerged a colossal structure made of pulsating lights and shadows that seemed alive. Each fragment floated as if defying gravity, aligning itself into patterns that defied logic. "We're looking at something that isn't from this universe," Aaliyah said, unable to look away. In the next instant, the voice came for the first time. "Welcome. Are you ready to be whole again?" The structure ahead was impossible to comprehend at first glance. Floating fragments of light and matter orbited around a core that seemed to pulse like a cosmic heart. Each piece appeared disconnected, yet there was an underlying pattern, something that defied human logic. "It's like a puzzle that assembles and disassembles at the same time," Aaliyah then said, her eyes glued to the analysis screen. But even her advanced instruments couldn't decipher what they were seeing. "The readings are contradictory. This shouldn't be possible." Cale Ariston, ever the skeptic, studied the structure with suspicion. "This could be a trap," he said, adjusting the ship's defensive systems. Ivar Droz, the pilot, agreed. "Something like this doesn't just appear out of nowhere. What if this is what's left of all the ships that disappeared?" The thought hung in the air, but no one dared to respond. The truth was, they all felt it. Something deeper, something that seemed to be watching the crew just as they observed the structure. As the Odysseus drew closer, the rhythmic signal returned, more intense and clearer than before. Raina Sol, the linguist, focused on the patterns. "This isn't just a sound. It's a code, but it seems broken, like something is trying to communicate but doesn't have all the pieces." Cale frowned. "What if it's intentional? A test, maybe?" Raina hesitated, but there was something in her expression that suggested she already had suspicions, ones she wasn't ready to share. Suddenly, the ship was pulled by an invisible force. "We're being dragged," Ivar shouted, struggling to control the navigation systems. The controls wouldn't respond, and the ship's movement was smooth but irresistible. "Cut the engines," Cale ordered, but even without propulsion, the Odysseus continued its approach toward one of the structure's entrances. Outside, the fragments shifted, as if clearing a path to welcome them. "It's like we're being invited," Aaliyah said, a mix of fascination and fear in her voice. The entrance was a tunnel of light and shadow, its edges dissolving into shimmering particles. When the ship crossed through, everything became silent and still. The Odysseus's gravity remained stable, but there was a strange sense of displacement, as though they had crossed into another realm. Inside, the structure's corridors were vast and seemingly endless, with walls that pulsed faintly, emitting a bluish glow. Kale was the first to speak. "This isn't just a structure. It's alive." Aaliyah tried to make sense of the readings, but her instruments continued to fail. "I can't determine if this is matter or energy. It's like it's between states," she said, frustration evident in her voice. Then the walls around them began to glow more intensely, and images started to appear. Reflections of the crew materialized on the surfaces, but they weren't simple reflections. They moved independently, showing alternate versions of each crew member. Aaliyah saw a version of herself in an unfamiliar lab, manipulating something that looked dangerous. Kale saw himself older, with hardened eyes, leading a group of people in a hostile environment. The voice returned, clearer this time. "You are fragments, reflections of choices. Are you ready to be whole?" The question echoed in their minds more than in their ears. Kale clenched his fists. "Who's speaking? What do you want from us?" The answer came as a whisper. "Reconstruction. Wholeness. Choose, or remain fragmented." The crew exchanged glances, uncertain of what it meant to be whole. But they knew they had crossed a threshold where there was no turning back. The core of the structure was unlike anything they had encountered before. A colossal chamber opened before them, with what appeared to be a floating pedestal at its center. Above the pedestal, a crystalline fragment of light rotated slowly, emitting soft pulses that seemed to resonate directly within their bodies. The surrounding walls vibrated in sync, forming hypnotic patterns. Aaliyah Ven, unable to contain her curiosity, took a few steps forward. This is the source," she murmured. Kale extended a hand to stop her. "Don't touch anything until we understand what this is." The voice returned, clearer than ever. "You have reached the point of convergence. This is the fragment, the center of all that is and could be." The words echoed in the crew's minds, each syllable imbued with meaning that seemed to surpass human understanding. Raina Sol, the linguist, fixed her gaze on the pedestal. "This isn't just energy. It's language. It's communicating with us, but not in the way we're used to. It's like a concept translated into light." Kale looked at her, wary. "And what exactly is it saying?" Raina hesitated. "That we are part of it." The psychological effects began to intensify. As the fragment pulsed, each crew member started experiencing visions. Aaliyah saw flashes of a laboratory where she worked on a project that changed humanity's history, but also caused irreversible destruction. Ivar saw a version of himself abandoning the Odysseus in a moment of crisis, saving his own life but dooming the others. Kale Ariston saw a reflection of himself, older and burdened by impossible decisions. "These aren't just memories," he said. "They're possibilities." The fragment began projecting holographic images around the chamber, showing what appeared to be a fragmented universe. Each piece represented an alternate reality, some full of life and prosperity, others teetering on the edge of collapse. "You are fragments of choices," the voice said. "You chose, lost, and gained. Now you must decide. Integrate or forget." The words left the crew in silence. "Integration? Forgetting? What is it talking about?" Ivar asked, his voice heavy with tension. Raina began to grasp the fragment's purpose. "This is a point of convergence," she said, her voice almost trance-like. "It's where all possibilities meet, but it's broken. The pieces don't align, and that's why it's calling us. It needs something, us, to be complete." Aaliyah looked at her, alarmed. "You're saying it wants us to become part of it? To sacrifice something?" Raina nodded, but before she could continue, the voice spoke again. "Wholeness requires a price. You must decide what will remain, and what will be lost. The tension in the chamber grew. Kale clenched his fists, trying to stay focused. This is absurd. We can't make choices without understanding the consequences. The fragment responded immediately. The consequences already exist. You are only choosing which ones will continue. The phrase seemed to echo differently for each of them, as if tailored to their thoughts. To Aaliyah, it was an invitation. To Ivar, a threat. To Kale, a judgment. And to Reyna, an inevitability. The fragment pulsed again, this time with greater intensity, and the chamber began to transform. Corridors and walls dissolved, revealing more visions. Realities where the Odysseus had never existed, worlds where humanity was nothing but a memory, and futures where the fragment was the key to the survival of entire civilizations. The voice grew more urgent. Choose. The universe does not wait. Kale looked at his crew, realizing they were at a breaking point, not just with the mission but with their very identities. The visions provoked by the fragment were becoming unbearable. They weren't just images or memories. They were lived experiences, as if each fragment of reality was being forced upon the crew's minds. Aaliyah then collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. I saw a world where my research destroyed entire cities, she said, sobbing. It was a perfect energy solution, but it cost millions of lives. Kale Ariston, always steady, tried to help her stand. This isn't real, Aaliyah. These are possibilities, not certainties. Reyna Sol, on the other hand, seemed more composed. Her visions were just as intense, but something within her accepted them differently. It's not about what could have been, she said, her voice calm. It's about what must be. The fragment isn't testing us. It's showing us the responsibility of our choices. Her conviction drew confused but fascinated glances. Ivar Droz, the pilot, shook his head in denial. We're not gods, Reyna. We can't decide who lives and who dies. The chamber began to tremble slightly, as if the structure itself was reacting to the crew's hesitation. The images around them intensified, showing entire worlds forming and collapsing in the blink of an eye. One reality depicted a version of the Odysseus navigating between galaxies, carrying the knowledge of the fragment and transforming humanity into an interplanetary species. Another showed a universe where the fragment was destroyed, leading to the disintegration of all realities connected to it. Time is running out, the voice said, now with a more urgent tone. Kale faced a deep internal conflict. As the mission's leader, he felt responsible for protecting his crew, but the fragment was forcing him to question everything. The visions showed versions of himself that had failed as a captain, as a leader, as a human being. I saw worlds where I let everyone die, he said quietly, and others where I saved lives but lost what it meant to be human. His confession caused the others to exchange glances, realizing they were all trapped in their own judgments. Reyna began to approach the pedestal where the fragment floated. Her expression was serene but determined. If we keep hesitating, everything will be lost, she said. The fragment is offering us something no other species has had, the chance to shape the universe. But it requires sacrifice. Aaliyah tried to stop her. You can't just decide this for all of us. Reyna paused for a moment and looked at her. It's not about deciding for you. It's about deciding with you. The fragment pulsed more intensely, and the chamber began to disintegrate around them. Corridors collapsed, and the blue lights flickered erratically. We're out of time, Ivar shouted, trying to regain control of the ship systems. But the Odysseus's instruments wouldn't respond. The fragment's voice echoed one last time. Choose. Wholeness requires a price. There is no path without loss. The words were simple but carried an overwhelming weight. Finally, Kale spoke up. If this choice needs to be made, it will be a collective decision, he said, his voice firm. He looked at each crew member, waiting for a sign of agreement. Reyna nodded, while Aaliyah and Ivar hesitated. I don't like this, Ivar said, staring at the floor. But I don't see another way. Aaliyah, still battling her fears, finally relented. If it means saving something, then we have to try. Reyna stepped closer to the fragment, extended her hand, and said, "We are ready to accept the price." Light exploded throughout the chamber, enveloping them in a brilliance so intense it seemed to deconstruct their very minds. The enveloping light wasn't just visible, it was sensory. The crew felt as though every atom of their bodies was being dismantled and reassembled, while memories, emotions, and fragments of reality surged through them. Aaliyah then screamed, her voice echoing through the chamber. "I see everything and nothing at the same time." Her mind was being bombarded by visions of worlds that had never existed and lives she had never lived. Cale Ariston, always the pillar of rationality, struggled to stay focused, but even he was overwhelmed by the intensity of the experience. The fragment spoke directly into their minds. "You are parts of a greater whole. Every choice you made, every decision you took, has shaped this moment." The voice was now more personal, as if addressing each of them uniquely. Ivar Droz saw flashes of his own life, moments of cowardice, bravery, and betrayal. He fell to his knees, clutching his head. "This can't be real. It can't all be me." Reyna, however, remained steady, as if she had anticipated this deconstruction. "It's not about you," she murmured. "It's about what you represent." At the center of the chamber, the fragment began to change. The crystalline light that once seemed solid was now expanding and fragmenting again, forming shapes resembling constellations. Each pulse was an echo of something greater, something the crew couldn't yet fully comprehend. Aaliyah noticed the pattern. "It's reconstructing itself based on us," she said, breathless. "Each fragment we see is a reflection of our own choices, our own lives." Cale shook his head, trying to ignore the weight of her statement. "So what happens when it's finished?" The fragment responded without words. Images began to form around them. Worlds being reconstituted, civilizations rising and falling, entire realities balanced on the brink of stability and collapse. The message was clear: their choices would shape the universe. "But at what cost?" Cale asked aloud. The answer came immediately: wholeness demands sacrifice. There is no creation without destruction. Reyna, now almost in a trance, replied, "Sacrifice isn't loss, it's acceptance." The environment began to react to the crew's emotions. The walls pulsed with vivid colors, reflecting each person's inner turmoil. For Ivar, they showed familiar faces, people he had lost or abandoned. For Aaliyah, they were versions of herself that had achieved great things but at the expense of her humanity. Cale saw the Odysseus destroyed in a possible future, leaving him to wander alone in the void. Each vision forced them to confront the weight of their choices and the implications of their actions. "It wants us to decide what deserves to continue," Reyna said. The choice began to take shape. At the center of the chamber, the fragment projected two clear possibilities. One path where humanity evolved, using the fragment's knowledge to achieve new levels of existence but destroying all other civilizations connected to the static zone. And another where the fragment was left behind, allowing realities to coexist but condemning humanity to stagnation. "Both paths come with loss," Aaliyah said, tears in her eyes. "Neither is perfect." Cale stepped into his role as leader. "If this is what the fragment wants, we need to decide together," he said, looking at each of his companions. "But we know what this means. Whatever we choose, we won't be the same." Reyna, her eyes fixed on the fragment, took a step forward. "This isn't about what's right or wrong. It's about accepting what comes next." With her words, the fragment pulsed more intensely, waiting for their final decision. A choice that would change the fate of the universe forever. The fragment pulsed like a star on the verge of collapse. Each pulse was accompanied by a rhythmic sound, almost like a heartbeat, echoing deeply within the crew's minds. The chamber around them seemed to float between dimensions, its edges dissolving into particles of light and shadow. Cale Ariston felt the weight of the choice they had to make, not just in his mind but in his very body. It was as if the universe was pressing against every atom of his existence. "Whatever we choose, it will define us forever," he said. Reyna's soul, who seemed perfectly in sync with the fragment, stepped forward. "The decision has already been made within us," she said, her voice carrying an almost supernatural calm. Ivar Droz reacted immediately, his distrust spilling over. You can't decide that on your own. We don't even know what this thing really wants. But Reyna turned to him, her eyes glowing with the same light as the fragment. It's not about what it wants. It's about what the universe needs. The visions around them intensified, showing divergent futures in terrifyingly vivid detail. In one reality, humanity harnessed the fragment's power to conquer the stars, but at the cost of all cosmic diversity. Gigantic ships floated through vast deserts of empty space, spreading a single truth, a single culture. In another, the fragment was destroyed, allowing infinite realities to coexist, but condemning humanity to an era of darkness and isolation. Aaliyah Ven trembled as she watched, her eyes fixed on the images. We're choosing between absolute control and the freedom to lose everything, she whispered. The fragment spoke again, its voice now clear and unified. Convergence requires a final sacrifice. Who among you will be the anchor? The meaning was clear. One of them would have to integrate fully with the fragment, becoming part of its essence to stabilize the choice made. Kale looked at the others, his face grim. I'm the captain. If anyone is going to bear this burden, it's me. But before he could take another step, Reyna raised her hand. No, Kale. From the beginning, I knew it would be me. Aaliyah and Ivar protested simultaneously. You can't do this alone, Aaliyah shouted, grabbing Reyna's arm. But Reyna smiled, a smile filled with acceptance and serenity. My whole life has been about seeking understanding, finding meaning. This is the moment that defines all of it. And it's not an end. It's a beginning. She turned to Kale, who hesitated but finally nodded. If you're certain, then we have no right to stop you, he said, his voice heavy. Reyna reached out and touched the fragment, and light exploded across the chamber like a supernova, engulfing everything in an absolute glow. Each member of the crew was overwhelmed by an indescribable sensation, a mixture of euphoria, loss, and profound connection to something greater. Aaliyah saw all her choices and possibilities align into a single thread, while Ivar felt the weight of his mistakes dissipate, leaving only clarity. For Kale, it was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the true purpose of their mission: to accept chaos and order as inseparable parts of a greater whole. When the light faded, Reyna was no longer there. The fragment had fully reformed, now pulsing with stable, serene energy. The structure around them began to dissolve, and the crew was ejected back to the Odysseus, now navigating normal space. Kale stared at the fragment floating in the ship's lab core, a silent reminder of Reyna's sacrifice. But before he could say anything, her voice echoed softly in their minds. Wholeness is not the end. It is just the next step. The Odysseus floated in the void of known space, but the silence aboard the ship was deeper than anyone had anticipated. The fragment, now stabilized and resting in the core of the lab, emitted a constant, gentle glow, as if it were asleep or waiting. Kale Ariston stood before it, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the object that had redefined everything he knew about the universe. She's still there, he said softly. Aaliyah Ven, standing beside him, nodded faintly. Reyna hasn't disappeared. She's become this. Ivar Droz entered the room, visibly shaken but trying to mask his emotions. So, what do we do now? He asked, his voice heavy with skepticism and exhaustion. Kale turned slowly. We report what we've seen. What happened? Ivar scoffed, incredulous. You think anyone's going to believe us? They'll want to study it, use it, and maybe destroy everything. Aaliyah stepped in, her expression serious. The fragment isn't something we can control. It gave us a choice because it knew we were ready to understand the weight of it. But I don't think humanity is ready for this. As the crew debated, small phenomena began to occur aboard the ship. Echoes of light flickered through the corridors, and some areas of the Odysseus exhibited inexplicable alterations, almost as if the fragment was influencing the space around it. This isn't over, Aaliyah said, observing the energy patterns on the monitors. The fragment isn't just an object. It's a portal. It's still connected to the static zone and maybe to something even greater. Kale, pondering her words, felt a chill run through him. So, it's only a matter of time before we're pulled back. Reyna's message echoed in everyone's minds. Wholeness is not the end. It is just the next step. Each crew member interpreted those words differently. For Kale, they signified responsibility, the burden of carrying something that could shape the future of all species. For Elia, it was a promise of understanding, a chance to learn and grow even at a cost. For Ivar, it was a warning that not everything should be touched and that some choices might be too dangerous to make. When the Odysseus finally reached fleet space, Kale's report was met with disbelief. Some scientific leaders were fascinated, demanding access to the fragment, while others called for its immediate destruction, fearing it posed an existential risk. Kale stood firm in his position. The fragment cannot be treated as a tool or a weapon. It is something far greater, and we must respect what it represents, or we'll face the consequences. In the depths of space, the static zone began to reform. Fragments of light and shadow spun around a new core, as if the universe was testing another group, another crew, another species. Inside the fragment aboard the Odysseus, Reyna still existed, not as a human but as part of something greater. And, in some way, her presence was felt by the crew, especially by Kale. During solitary nights on the bridge, he could hear her voice, soft yet firm. The universe is a web of choices. What you do next will define everything. The Odysseus continued its journey, carrying the fragment and the weight of their decision. The crew knew that Reyna's sacrifice was not the end, but the beginning of something they couldn't yet fully comprehend. Every choice they made, every star they explored, was shaped by the knowledge that they were mere fragments in an infinite cosmos. And as the fragment pulsed quietly in the ship's core, one certainty remained. The universe would never be the same again.